Hey everyone, how's it going? Let's talk about Signalis, a game that has been highly received among the indie community as well as the survival horror community. It's a title that invokes a lot of mystery surrounding it, like astronomers debating and contrasting old and new theories of the universe altogether. It was one that I'd been meaning to play for a long time, but I was never really in the mindset or the mood to approach it. This was also a habit of my gaming moods in the past where I would only play specific genres for a fairly long period of time, which meant that it would take a mood change to finally transition to a new experience or return to a phase I was in before. Historically, horror has been one of those genres where I would only ever engage in it if the mood would strike. But now that I'm making conscious efforts to diversify in terms of content, it'll enable me to ignore my moods and just talk about the things I want to talk about anyways, just because it's interesting. Signalis is most certainly an interesting game and definitely not what I was thinking it was going to be. When I initially saw the trailer and the gameplay, it had a Blade Runner vibe running in its Silent Hill inspired veins. I thought it was an awesome combination, and it's not like you couldn't have a sci-fi dystopian or cyberpunk horror game. Just take a look at Observer, for example, made by the same studio that did the recent Silent Hill 2 remake. I liked the investigative elements tied into the central narrative, only for it to turn into a situation that you can no longer control or solve. Signalis, from a narrative point of view, is like a case that doesn't want to be solved, and is mainly up to your interpretation of what happened. It was designed to have an infinite pool of interpretations and theories as to the what and why, and no theory or interpretation is necessarily invalid. But looking at it as a game is much simpler. And that game turns out to be an old school inspired survivor horror game, but with the avoidance of using any word of God in its storytelling. What does word of God mean in terms of storytelling? Basically, if an author or a creator puts something in and makes it as a truth, then it is considered canon. In Signalis, this isn't the case whatsoever because the developers made conscious efforts to avoid any definite or absolute truths in the storyline. A way to look at it as well is that the game itself deals in the unknowns, questions that never fully get answered and nothing necessarily concrete is ever given. The developers had an approach to the narration and the world building where even if you read all the bits of lore and books laced within each chapter of the game, you're still asking a lot of questions and you're not given the full picture entirely. This approach is also inspired by its nods to the cosmic horror genre, where characters end up in unique and terrifying situations that are beyond their control and understanding. Some might think that it's lazy story writing, being afraid to give out, even just a semblance of truth or something absolute. And the thing is, this approach to storytelling can get, boring if it's not engaging enough to the person reading the story. But horror as a genre is at its absolute best in two departments. One, not fully understanding what you're going up against. If the horror had a definite way of being easily defeated, never to return, then it just would not be scary anymore. Signalis doesn't do this. Two, the fear of losing something. When you have nothing to lose, then the horror is pointless and just flat out does not work. In Signalis, your character has something to lose and is a core element to the story that matters the most in the game. Combining old school Resident Evil gameplay, Silent Hill-like atmosphere, and metaphorical, cryptic, and unreliable storytelling and world building of other works like Blade Runner, The King in Yellow, as well as other literary works that the game shows and makes direct references to, makes Signalis a survival horror experience that truly does stand out in its own way, while faltering in certain aspects of the game department. So, let's take a dive into Signalis. The story has many layers and will require a lot of reading, brainstorming, and patience to get a general idea of the main concepts and themes that are explored in Signalis. There are other channels that have exhaustively reached great heights to find every comb and theory to piece its overall story together. I'm not going to go to that length, but I will have a few things to say. For starters, it's a very compelling and rich world that's hidden behind its themes. The reading that you discover in the chapters, the interactions between the characters that you meet, as well as your gradual but uncertain understanding of the events that are unfolding, make for a memorable story to just uncover. The story itself is written to have unreliable narration, characters' perspectives being warped by their awareness of what they think is going on and what they believe, and it seems to be a horrifying reality that they feel is real, or is it? On the first playthrough of the game, I was more focused on the exploration and the gameplay. gauging whether I would enjoy it or not, while doing some reading, and there is quite a lot of reading to do, like I said. In fact, the reading isn't just there for lore reasons either, it's actually integral to developing a better understanding of what's going on, the world that you're in, who the factions are, and what the replicas are. You play as Elster, a replica who was created based on an existing human being. Elster is a replica designed for specific roles and functions, and other replicas you meet will not only be different in design, but also in terms of how they interact with the world. The story begins at what is called a Penrose ship. The ship itself is part of a program designed to send replicas, including a host to the stars, in the search for new planets for the nation of Yusan, a communist-like government that doesn't have a lot of color variety, which is evident in the places that you end up in. You do a round check for the ship's systems, and inside the ship, there's a cryo chamber that appears to be empty. This leads to your character leaving the ship in the search for the missing person. You leave the ship, and the trek leads you to the mining facility called S-23 Sierpinski on the planet Leng. This place is more or less the centerpiece for where the majority of the story occurs, and over time you will see other places as well. The moment you go inside is the moment where it becomes a point of no return. You have one personal objective that is more important than anything else, and that is to find your loved one. This was a part of the story that I was also focused on because it was one of the most comprehensive aspects of the game's overall narrative. And a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle regarding the overall themes and the narrative was something to look at and delve into further after beating the game, where I could take my time with it. I do the same thing with more complex stories, whether it's in film, games, or in books. Signalis is just not a game you're going to understand on your first playthrough, period. But when you boil it down, the game is ultimately a love story that's interwoven with elements of cosmic horror, identity, memories, dreams, reality, and existentialism, as well as tragedy. The themes go a lot deeper though as you go further, but the exploratory aspects of its narrative and its world to uncover makes Signalis a fantastic game to study and dissect in this department. It's a game with twists and turns, harrowing moments, genuinely moving story beats that will definitely pluck at the heartstrings for those that get emotional over stories with heavy subjects. The engaging storyline and world building is also supported by the amazing sense of atmosphere, the music, and its art style. Each level has an identical and uniform design to it, most notably in the Sierpinski facility and Rotfront. But the circumstances of the situation and the threats that you'll face also add layers to the cold-like nature of the locations. A lot of the levels will make you feel isolated at times, just like in other survival horror games, where it really boils down to your strategic approach to managing your resources, engaging or disengaging in combat, as well as knowing what items to take, as well as planning the safest routes. Survival horror games are a genre that I haven't fully combed entirely. I've tried the original 3 Resident Evil games, I've played the first Silent Hill, and I've played other survival horror games that don't really operate on the same formula as the old school Resident Evil or Silent Hill games. Signalis takes notes from both, making it into a throwback survival horror experience for people that grew up with them, but it was also designed to be an accessible start for those that are new to this type of game. We have heaps of them now, with a few notable releases like The Glass Staircase, Crow Country, Lone Survivor, Lost in Vivo, Cry of Fear, Daymare 98, Tormented Souls, and many more. While I'm not the biggest fan of tank controls or fixed cameras and backtracking, I've always enjoyed their storylines, the world building, and the sense of atmosphere. In saying that, the gameplay is something that can still be fun depending on what game it is specifically, but other times it can get boring and repetitive, where even if it functions like it's supposed to, it still just doesn't click for me. Signalis for me is unfortunately one of those games. But before I delve into that, I want to talk a bit more about the things that I do like about the game. Again, the atmosphere is great. I love how each area, even while uniform in its color variety and its mood and design, invokes feelings of wonder where you still want to uncover its secrets, but also feel the sense of dread in terms of what comes next. The music and the art style also blend together like a happy marriage. The music is pretty similar to the tracks you would hear in the Silent Hill games. Lots of moody ambience that ebbs and flows depending on where you are. The combat music though did eventually get on my nerves. Overall though, the soundtrack is just great. And I sometimes play the music whether I comb through Pinterest or other art sites looking for moody landscapes or fictional works with dark undertones, or whenever I'm writing or brainstorming ideas together. It's a soundtrack that works well in the background outside of the game, but works a lot better within the game when it's applied to the story beats, amplifying the moods and the feelings that can build up when you're truly invested in the narrative. The art style, I love it. Its use of old analog-based technology, its consistent but draining color tone, and the use of low-poly 3D-based modeling and the isometric style camera made for some pleasing retro eye candy throughout the game. There are also times where I would even go into first person mode and you can get the scale of things much better. It kind of made me wish that the game also had an FPS mode. The designs of the replicas are striking and memorable. The enemies, while limited, are intimidating in the design, and the bosses also have some neat designs too. A lot of what I like about Signalis is the stuff outside of the gameplay, which is where my thoughts begin to sour. When it comes to the gameplay, the simple and functional framework usually works best for survival horror games. The focus is generally more so on the resource management and, your strategic approach to combat scenarios. I'm not expecting it to be massively complex, like what you see in Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, or a frantic sort of shooter experience like, say, Trepang 2, but it needs to be at the very least fun. What ended up happening for me in Signalis is that I was enjoying the game for a while. I knew that it played like Resident Evil and pretended that it was a Resident Evil game and played it as such. You backtrack, find key items, use said key items to go where they need to go, solve puzzles, either fight or evade enemies, and find the save rooms to save and store items. But this game would end up getting not only repetitive for me, but also boring down the track. By the time I got to the end of chapter 1, just before getting to the mines, I was ready to drop the game right then and there, because I realized that the game was never going to evolve past its pacing or its gameplay. Each chapter has you running around with a limited inventory space, 6 items with 2 modules or 8 on the extended option, fighting the enemies only for them to get back up if you don't burn them, which is a twist on the formula, running out of space because you need key items, going back to the save room, picking up item, only to find more items, fighting or evading other enemies, all in a way that uniquely annoyed me out of any other survival horror game that I played. The Resident Evil games also had backtracking as well as inventory management too, but the pacing between each area in those games was a lot more dynamic in comparison to the pacing in Signalis. The original trilogy had exploration-based areas that were open-ended and slow-paced, but would also change the pacing in other areas, making some more linear, short, and self-contained, or areas that are like a sequence of fights. This helped me ignore the backtracking fatigue most of the time because the attention to detail and how each area in the first 3 games required different levels of pacing helped keep things fresh. You want places like the mansion and the police station and the streets of Raccoon City to be open-ended and make you want to explore. You want smaller areas in between to take elements from them and modify the pacing to fit the situation, whether it's a chase moment, a series of fights, or a short expedition to take you to the next big area. The 3 areas in Signalis are beautiful in their look, but when I get to nowhere, it felt like I was just doing the exact same thing all over again with the same pacing, but in a different area with no map. And the same feeling carried over in the final area too. Thank God the game was short because I would have gone insane over this and would have eventually just said, fuck this, I'm done. The only variations between the 3 main areas that you explore in Signalis is the look of them, the volume of the enemies that you fight, and the different puzzles that you have. I wasn't playing it for the gameplay at this point anymore, and knowing that I was near the end, I was looking forward to finishing it so I could finally move on from it and enjoy the best aspects of the game, which would be the world building, the lore, and the story. Even though I don't like the gameplay of Signalis that much, it does work like it's supposed to, and the combat, while simple, can be engaging at times. But most of the time, you won't even need to fight a lot of the enemies because you can generally just evade them with ease. The only times where I really did engage in the combat was when I had the equipment to permanently get rid of the enemies, like say with the thermite or the flare gun, in an area where I was going to return to frequently, or when I would reach a boss. Healing items are usually plentiful and there are multiple types. You also have your standard fare of weapons like a pistol, revolver, machine gun, shotgun, rifle, and grenade launcher, but I didn't find the grenade launcher, and by that point I stopped caring. You have utility items that can assist you in tense situations like the stun rod and the flare. Throughout the game, you also pick up modules that'll become important to solving the puzzles necessary to help you progress through the levels. There's the flashlight to get you through dark rooms, an eye module that lets you take pictures to assist you in solving puzzles, although alternatively you can just use your phone instead, even though it's less immersive. Then you have the radio module. This is also a module that acts as its own inventory slot that you will use to catch frequencies that can give you codes to a safe, or when you go into a room with interruptions, you'll do this mini game of sorts where you tune your radio to a specific frequency in order to stop these interruptions from continuing on and damaging you as you go around the room. The game boils down to finding key items, solving puzzles, trying to avoid enemies as much as possible, going to the save room, saving, make room, and repeat the cycle again until you finally move on to the next area. Rinse and repeat. Like I said, there are sections where it does turn into an FPS, but it also becomes a fucking walking simulator, and I was getting PTSD due to how slow your character moves in these sections. The game has multiple endings that you can also go for and does give you incentives to do replays, but unfortunately the gameplay just wasn't that good for me this time because of how repetitive and boring it becomes, which is tied to the backtracking, which is tied to the repetitive pacing that makes you feel like you're doing the first big area multiple times. The combat is fine when you do decide to go for it, like I said, but I stopped caring about it once I realized that you can generally just maneuver around the enemies in most rooms. And a lot of the times, the enemies will inevitably get up anyways if you don't permanently get rid of them. And the bosses just boil down to just exploiting that one weakness they have, and that's it. I'm not going to play this game ever again, but I will continue to uncover the story more because I find that more fun than the actual game itself, and playing on a harder difficulty wouldn't necessarily improve my experience when I'm already not enjoying it. It would just aggravate me even more. At that point, I would rather the game just be more fun to play. All in all, I'm glad I finally gave Signalis a try. It's been on my list for a long time since its release, and I know that it's a game that quite a lot of gamers hold dearly. It also has a community of people that make animations, and they also faithfully keep the game's amazing art style intact. When I hear about the game being a masterpiece, I think of the amazing storyline, the emotional narratives, and deep themes interwoven into the game's interesting setting, as well as the atmosphere and music tied into it. But when it comes to the gameplay, I don't agree at all. And there are far better alternatives in the survival horror department, even long before this game released. When it comes to games, a good sign of a good game is when it's the first thing I think about doing as soon as I get home from work or, just going out or something. But when it came to Signalis, every time I thought about playing the game, I wanted to do the exact opposite every second because of the gameplay. It's not even bad or terrible, I just find it repetitive and boring, and finishing it felt like a relief so I could finally enjoy reading into the world of Signalis, which was actually more fun for me. As a survival horror game, it does deserve its flowers, and despite my disappointments in the gameplay department, it is still a worthwhile experience. For all of its flaws, it does offer an authentic survival horror experience for those that grew up with the older Resident Evil and Silent Hill games. Great atmosphere, a variety of puzzles to solve, an emphasis on resource management and making smart choices for encounters, and a deep and complex narrative to unravel. The developers have definitely put a ton of effort into the things that I do like, but if they ever make a similar project or a sequel, I would like to see more engaging gameplay, more enemy variety, and more dynamic pacing to keep things fresh. If you're an old school fan of the genre, or are new to it, you'll definitely like Signalis because even in spite of my issues with the gameplay, it is a very faithful recreation of a beloved era, and for these developers, that is a dream that has come true. Thanks for watching.